The Tale of the Trader and the Ginee. A wealthy merchant, who conducted business in various cities, set out one day on horseback to collect debts in certain towns. The heat became unbearable for him, so he took refuge under a tree and reached into his saddlebags to grab some bread and dry dates to eat while he broke his fast. After finishing his meal and forcefully throwing away the date stones, an Ifrit appeared, towering in size and wielding a drawn sword. It approached the merchant and threatened to kill him, claiming that he had killed its son. The merchant asked how he had killed the Ifrit's son, to which it replied that when he threw away the date stones, one hit its son in the chest and killed him instantly. The merchant responded by saying, "Truly, from Allah we come and to Allah we return. There is no power or might except by the will of Allah, the Almighty, the All-Great. If I did indeed kill thy son, it was a tragic accident." The merchant begged for forgiveness, but the jinn replied, "There is no help, I must kill you." The jinn then seized the merchant, dragged him along and threw him to the ground, raising his sword to strike. The merchant wept and committed his case to Allah, reciting a poem. The poem is saying that life is composed of two parts, good and bad days, and that everything in life has its own share of pleasure and pain. The poem is also pointing out that nature is not always fair, and that everything has its own price. For example, when the wind blows strongly, it's only the big trees that suffer, but the small ones remain unharmed. Even though life is not always fair, the poem encourages to be grateful for the good days and not to dwell on the bad ones. The poem also compares the value of pearls that are hidden in the depths of the sea to the floating dead bodies on the surface of the water. The poem is trying to say that the things that seem valuable may not always be so, and vice versa. Finally, the poem concludes by saying that one should appreciate the good days and not to complain about the pain and suffering, as it is a natural part of life. When the merchant finished reciting his poem, the jinn said to him, "Stop talking and prepare to die." The jinn was still intent on killing the merchant despite his apology and explanation. But the merchant replied, "Listen, O Ifrit, I have debts that need to be paid, I have wealth, children, a wife and many possessions. Allow me to go home and settle my affairs, and I will return to you at the beginning of the new year." He swore by Allah that he would return and that Allah is witness to his promise. The jinn accepted his oath and let him go. The merchant went back to his city, settled his affairs, paid off his debts and informed his wife and children of what had happened to him. He also appointed a guardian for his family and spent a full year with them. Then, he arose, performed the wuzu ablution to purify himself before death, took his shroud under his arm, bid farewell to his family, friends and relatives, and left despite their pleas. They began weeping and wailing and beating their breasts over him, but he traveled until he arrived at the same garden, and the day of his arrival was the beginning of the new year, as he had promised to the jinn. As the merchant sat weeping, an old man, a Shaykh, approached him leading a chained gazelle. The Shaykh greeted the merchant and asked him why he was sitting alone in this place, as it was known to be a haunt of evil spirits. The merchant told him about his encounter with the Ifrit and a promise he made to return. The old man, who was the owner of the gazelle, was amazed and said, "By Allah, your faith is strong and your story is truly unique. If it were engraved with engravers on the corners of the eyes, it would serve as a warning to those who would heed it." The old man sat down next to the merchant and said, "By Allah, my brother, I will not leave you until I see what happens with you and this Ifrit." As the two of them talked, the merchant began to feel fear, terror, sorrow, and despair. The old man with the gazelle stayed by his side. Suddenly, a second Shaykh approached them, accompanied by two dogs, both greyhounds and both black. The second old man, after greeting them, also asked them about their situation and why they were sitting in such a place. They told him their story, and soon enough, a third Shaykh approached them, accompanied by a she-mule with a bright bay coat. He greeted them and asked them the same question, and they told him their story. As they were talking, a dust cloud appeared and a mighty sand devil emerged from it. The cloud opened and within it was the Ginee, holding a drawn sword and his eyes shooting sparks of rage. He went to them, pulled the merchant away from the others, and shouted at him, "Stand up so I can kill you, just as you killed my son, the life of my liver." The merchant wailed and wept, and the three old men also began to cry and weep with him. Then, the first old man, the owner of the gazelle, stepped forward, kissed the hand of the Ifrit and said, "O Ginee, you are the crown of the kings of the jinn. If I were to tell you the story of me and this gazelle, and you find it amazing, would you give me a third of this merchant's blood? The Ginee replied, yes, if you tell me a story and I find it amazing, then I will give you a third of his blood. The old man then began to tell the first Shaykh's story. The old man began to tell the story of how his niece, who was a gazelle, had learned grammar, divination, and scholarly arts from a young age. She had then used her powers to turn his son into a calf and his maid, the mother of his son, into a heifer, and gave them to a herdsman to take care of. When he returned from a long journey, he asked about his son and maid, but the gazelle niece told him that the maid was dead and his son had fled and she did not know where he went. He spent a whole year with a heavy heart, crying until the time of the great festival of Allah came. He then sent a message to the herdsman to pick a fat heifer for him. The herdsman brought him one that turned out to be the maid, whom his niece had enchanted. He prepared to slaughter her, but she let out a loud moo and tears came out. He was surprised and pitied her and stopped. He told the herdsman to bring him another instead. His cousin then said, slaughter her, for you will not find a fatter or fairer heifer. But as he was about to slaughter her again, she let out a loud moo once more. Feeling compassion, he stopped and ordered the herdsman to slaughter and skin her instead. The herdsman killed and skinned her, but found only hide and bones, no fat or flesh. He regretted his actions when it was too late. He gave her to the herdsman and asked him to bring him a fat calf. It turned out to be his son, who was enchanted. When the calf saw him, it broke its tether and ran to him, fawned on him, wailed and shed tears. He pitied him and said to the herdsman, bring me a heifer and let this calf go. His cousin, the gazelle, then shouted at him, you must kill this calf, this is a holy day, and nothing is to be killed except that which is perfect and pure. And we don't have any calf fatter or fairer than this. He replied, look at the condition of the heifer that I slaughtered at your command, and how we were disappointed by her and she didn't benefit us in any way. I regret with all my heart that I killed her. He said, so this time, I will not follow your command to sacrifice this calf. She replied, by Allah, the most great, the compassionating, the compassionate. There is no other way, you must kill him on this holy day. If you don't, you are not a man to me and I am not your wife. The old man further told that when he heard her harsh words, not understanding her intention, he went to the calf with a knife in his hand. And his story was incomplete as the storyteller, Shahrazad, stopped the story due to the dawn of day. The king was so intrigued by the story that he decided not to kill her and wanted to hear the rest of the story the next night. The next day, the king went to the court and the wazir went with his daughter's shroud under his arm. The king issued orders and promoted some people and deposed others until the end of the day. He did not tell the wazir what had happened the previous night. The wazir was surprised by the king's behavior, and when the court was over, the king went back to his palace. When it was the second night, Ginee, the sister of Shahrazad, asked her to finish the story of the merchant and the Ginee. Shahrazad agreed and asked the king if she could continue the story. The king then gave her permission to continue the story. The merchant was about to sacrifice the calf, but when he saw it weeping, he changed his mind and said to the herdsman, keep the calf among my cattle. The old man who owned the gazelle told all this to the Ginee, who was surprised by this strange story. The gazelle's owner then continued the story, O Lord of the kings of the Jann, this happened and my uncle's daughter, this gazelle, watched it happen and said, butcher this calf, it is a fat one. But I ordered the herdsman to take it away and he took it and turned back home. The next day, as the old man was sitting in his house, the herdsman came and stood in front of him. He said, O my master, I have something to tell you that will make you happy and will earn me your gratitude. The old man replied, go ahead and tell me. The herdsman then said, O merchant, I have a daughter who learned magic in her childhood from an old woman who lived with us. Yesterday when you gave me the calf, I took it home to her and she looked at it and covered her face. She then cried and laughed alternately, and finally she said. The old man continued saying to the Ginee, when I heard this from the herdsman's daughter, I went out with him, and I was drunken without wine, from the excess of joy and gladness which came upon me, until I reached his house. There, his daughter welcomed me and kissed my hand, and forthwith the calf came and fawned upon me as before. I asked the herdsman's daughter, is this true that you say of this calf? She replied, yes, O my master, he is your son, the very core of your heart. And so the herdsman's daughter released the merchant's son from the enchantment, and the merchant married his son to her. The merchant's wife, who had cast the spell on his son and his mother, was also punished by the herdsman's daughter. The Ginee was amazed by the story and granted the old man a third of the merchant's blood as promised. And it is a wonderful tale and a strange. And now, O Ginee, I have told thee my story and I claim my third of the merchant's blood. The Ginee, upon hearing this story, marveled greatly and said, By Allah, O Shaykh, thy story is indeed wondrous and thy claim is just. I grant thee thy third of the merchant's blood. The second Shaykh's story. Understand, O ruler of the leaders of the Ginees, that these two dogs are my brothers and I am the third. Our father passed away and left us with an inheritance of 3,000 gold pieces. I used my share to start a store and did the same with my brothers. However, soon after I started, my elder brother sold his stock for 1,000 dinars and used the money to purchase goods and travel to other places. He traveled for a whole year with the trade group, but one day, as I sat in my shop, a beggar came to me asking for money and I told him to go to another door. He responded while crying, Don't you recognize me? I looked at him closely and realized it was my brother. I stood up and greeted him, then sat him down in my shop and asked him about his situation. He replied, Don't ask me, my wealth is gone and my situation has become worse. So I took him to the public bath and gave him clothes of mine and let him stay in my house. After reviewing my business stock and profits, I found that my hard work had earned me an additional 1,000 dinars and my initial investment, the main source of my wealth, was still 2,000 dinars. So I divided everything equally with him, saying consider that you never left, don't be upset about your bad luck. He was happy to accept the share and opened his own shop. Things continued smoothly for a few days. However, my second brother, also wanting to travel, sold all his goods and stock, despite our efforts to stop him. He prepared for the journey and left with some traders. After a year, he came back to me just like my elder brother, and when I asked him didn't I warn you not to travel? He cried and said it's fate, I'm now a beggar, penniless and without a shirt to wear. So I took him to the public bath, O Ginee, and gave him new clothes of mine and took him to my shop and fed him. And also I told him, Oh my brother, I usually check my shop's account at the beginning of every year, and whatever surplus I find is shared between us. So I calculated the balance, O Ginee, and found 2,000 dinars of profit. I thanked the Creator and gave half of it to my brother and kept the other half for myself. After that, he started a shop and we continued like that for many days. After some time, my brothers started asking me to travel with him, but I refused, saying what did you gain from traveling that I should gain the same? As I did not listen to them, we each went back to our own shops and continued buying and selling. They kept insisting for me to travel for a whole year, but I refused until 6 years had passed when I finally agreed and said, Oh my brothers, I am here, ready to travel with you, now let me see how much money you have. However, I found out that they had nothing. They had spent all their money on eating, drinking and pleasure. But, I didn't say anything negative, instead I checked my shop's account again, sold my goods and stock and found that I had 6,000 ducats. I happily divided that amount in half and said to my brothers, These 3,000 gold pieces are for us to trade with, and let's bury the other half underground so that it can be useful if anything bad happens to us. In that case, each of us can take 1,000 to start a shop. They both agreed and I gave each of them 1,000 gold pieces and kept the same amount for myself. We then prepared appropriate goods and rented a ship, loaded our merchandise and set out on our journey, day after day for a whole month. We finally reached a city where we sold our goods, earning 10 times the amount of gold we had invested. As we were ready to leave, we found a young woman on the shore wearing worn and tattered clothes. She kissed my hand and said, Oh master, do you have kindness and charity? I can repay you for them. I replied, Yes, I have benevolence and good works, even if you don't repay me. Then she said, Marry me, O my master, and take me to your city. I have given myself to you. Do me a kindness, I am one of those who are worthy of good works and charity. I will repay you and you will not be ashamed of my situation. When I heard her words, my heart felt inclined towards her, as Allah had willed, and I took her, gave her clothes and prepared a nice place for her on the ship, and treated her respectfully. So we continued our journey and my heart became very attached to her and I couldn't be separated from her day or night. I paid more attention to her than my brothers. Then they became estranged from me, they grew jealous of my wealth and the amount of merchandise I had, and they began to covetously look at all my property. They decided to kill me and take my wealth, saying let's kill our brother and all his money will be ours. Satan made this seem like a good idea to them. So when they found me alone, while I was sleeping next to my wife, they took both of us and threw us into the sea. My wife woke up startled from her sleep and immediately became an Afrita. She saved me and took me to an island and disappeared for a short time. But she returned the next morning and said, I am your loyal slave. I saved you from death by the command of the Almighty. Know that I am a Ginee, and when I saw you, my heart fell in love with you by the will of the Lord, because I am a believer in Allah and His Prophet, may Allah bless and preserve him. I came to you in the condition you saw me and you married me, and now I have saved you from drowning. But I am angry with your brothers and I must kill them. When I heard her story, I was surprised and thanked her for everything she had done. But I said, but I can't let you kill my brothers. I told her the whole story of what had happened to us from the beginning to the end. She said, I will fly over them tonight as a bird and sink their ship and kill them. I said, please don't, because the saying goes, oh you who do good to him who does evil, leave the evildoer to his evil deeds. Besides, they are still my brothers. But she insisted I have to kill them, there's no other way. I begged her for their forgiveness, then she carried me away and flew until she dropped me off on the rooftop of my own house. I opened the doors and took what I had buried, then I greeted the people and opened my shop and bought more merchandise. That night when I went home, I saw these two dogs tied up. When they saw me, they stood up and whined and fawned on me. But before I knew it, my wife said, these two dogs are your brothers. I asked who did this to them? And she replied, I sent a message to my sister and she turned them into this shape, and they won't be released until 10 years have passed. Now I am on my way to my wife's sister, so she can release them from this condition after they have been in this shape for half a dozen years. As I was on my way here, I saw this young man. He told me what had happened to him, and I decided not to leave until I see what happens between you and him. That's my story. The Ginee said, this is a strange story, so I will give you the third portion of his blood and his crime. Then the third Shaykh, the master of the muley, said to the Ginee, I can tell you a story that is even more amazing than these two, if you grant me the rest of his blood and his offense, and the Ginee agreed. Then the old man began to tell his story. The third Shaykh's story. Know, O Sultan and leader of the Ginees, that this mule was my wife. One day I went on a journey and was away for a whole year. When I returned home at night, I saw a black slave lying with her on the bed and they were talking, flirting, laughing, kissing, and playing the close buttock game. So when the butcher saw me, he took me in and brought me to his house. But as soon as his daughter saw me, she covered her face and cried out, are you bringing men to me and coming in with them to me? The butcher tried to explain to her that I was just a dog, but she refused to look at me. The butcher, feeling sorry for me, decided to keep me as a pet. And so I lived with him for a number of years until I had the opportunity to tell him my story and how I was cursed by my wife to be in the form of a dog. He helped me to find a way to break the curse and I was able to regain my human form. And that is my story. The butcher asked, where is the man? And she answered, this dog is a man whom his wife has enchanted and I can release him. When her father heard this, he said, please release him, my daughter. She replied, I can release him if he will swear by Allah that he will never again enter the house of any woman as a man and will never approach any woman in any fashion. When I heard her words, I swore the oath and she released me from the spell. And I returned to my own form, and Allah's name be praised for this. The daughter of the butcher used a jug of water, reciting some incantations over it, and then she sprinkled some of the water on the dog, saying come out of that form and back to your original form. And just like that, the dog returned to his human form. Then, after being transformed back to his human form, the man thanked the butcher's daughter and said, I wish you could do the same thing to my wife, as she did to me. The daughter gave him some of the water and instructed him on how to use it on his wife when she was asleep. So, he went back to his wife and found her sleeping. He sprinkled the water on her and recited the same words that the daughter had told him to say, and his wife transformed into a mare mule. The Ginee then turned towards the mule and asked if this was true, and the mule nodded her head as a sign of affirmation. Then the old man began to tell his story. The third Shaykh's story. Know, O Sultan and leader of the Ginees, that this mule was my wife. One day I went on a journey and was away for a whole year. When I returned home at night, I saw a black slave lying with her on the bed and they were talking, flirting, laughing, kissing, and playing the close buttock game. So when the butcher saw me, he took me in and brought me to his house. But as soon as his daughter saw me, she covered her face and cried out, are you bringing men to me and coming in with them to me? The butcher tried to explain to her that I was just a dog, but she refused to look at me. The butcher, feeling sorry for me, decided to keep me as a pet. And so I lived with him for a number of years until I had the opportunity to tell him my story and how I was cursed by my wife to be in the form of a dog. He helped me to find a way to break the curse and I was able to regain my human form. And that is my story. The butcher asked, "Where is the man?" And she answered, "This dog is a man whom his wife has enchanted and I can release him." When her father heard this, he said, "Please release him, my daughter." She replied, "I can release him if he will swear by Allah that he will never again enter the house of any woman as a man and will never approach any woman in any fashion." When I heard her words, I swore the oath and she released me from the spell. And I returned to my own form, and Allah's name be praised for this. The daughter of the butcher used a jug of water, reciting some incantations over it, and then she sprinkled some of the water on the dog, saying, "Come out of that form and back to your original form." And just like that, the dog returned to his human form. Then, after being transformed back to his human form, the man thanked the butcher's daughter and said, "I wish you could do the same thing to my wife, as she did to me." The daughter gave him some of the water and instructed him on how to use it on his wife when she was asleep. So, he went back to his wife and found her sleeping. He sprinkled the water on her and recited the same words that the daughter had told him to say, and his wife transformed into a mere mule. The genie then turned towards the mule and asked if this was true, and the mule nodded her head as a sign of affirmation. The old man's story had impressed the genie and he granted him the third of the merchant's blood. The storyteller, Dunyazad, praised the story and asked her sister to tell her more the next night if she lived, and the king spared her. The king, who was also impressed by the story, decided that he would not kill Dunyazad until he heard the rest of her tales. The night passed with the king and Dunyazad embracing each other. The next day, the king went to his court and attended to his duties as a ruler. He gave orders, judged, appointed, and deposed, and at the end of the day, he returned to his palace. When it was the third night, the king was extremely pleased with the story and he was also grateful to the old man who had saved the merchant. The old men were thanked by the merchant and they all left for their own cities. Dunyazad then told the king that the fisherman's story was even more wondrous than the one he had just heard. The king was curious and asked her to tell him the story of the fisherman and the genie.